Hey guys, welcome to Timpf. Yeah, it's been about a month since I hosted last time, and the reviews were amazing. I couldn't even walk down the street without being accosted by the fans. Okay, they were vagrants who live under the bridge near my apartment. But that reminds me that we should talk about fentanyl. First of all, yes, it is the reason that Greg is out. Yeah. I promised him I wouldn't say anything, but I feel like it's fine to lie to your boss who accuses you of doing drugs every day. But more importantly, I want to talk about why fentanyl is a huge problem and why the government can't be the one to solve it. Lately, there's been a lot of talk about classifying fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, or drug cartels as terrorist organizations, or any sale of fentanyl resulting in a fatal overdose as a federal crime worthy of the death penalty. But like that Lord of the Rings prequel show, all of it is a bad idea. Don't at me, nerds. Even you know it. Right. It's not that I think fentanyl poisoning is not a threat. And I do say poisoning because many of the people who have died from fentanyl didn't intend to take fentanyl at all. It's not like people are toasting with it at weddings or serving it at quinceañeras. A 2015 study in the Harm Reduction Journal found that 73% of heroin users who tested positive for fentanyl didn't even know they'd been using fentanyl. It's not just heroin users. It's been found in everything from pills to cocaine to MDMA. Fentanyl poisonings are a serious, widespread problem, but just because the government passes some law, that doesn't mean it's gonna help. Even if they give it a magical name like the No More Fentanyl Ever bill or the Inflation Reduction Act. Let's go, Brandon, am I right? Yeah, woo! That had nothing to do with anything I'm talking about. I just want everybody to clap for me. Thank you. I needed that. You don't know how much. Okay. Anyway, the CDC's 2016 guidelines that were cracking down on opiate prescriptions were actually disastrous for chronic pain patients. A 2019 FDA study found that patients who abruptly stopped opiate prescriptions were associated with an increased risk of psychological distress and even suicide. The CDC has proposed loosening some of those guidelines, which is a step in the right direction. A step people with chronic pain can only take, by the way, if they have their prescriptions. Restricting opiate prescriptions also hasn't even reduced opiate deaths. Actually, it's made it worse. As opiate prescriptions have fallen, so-called overdose fatalities have gone up. And much like Greg's forehead, it keeps getting higher. The consistent trend. We saw it in 2019, we saw it in 2020, and then last year the deaths reached an all-time high of more than 100,000. I think that every adult should have the right to put whatever they want into their own body without risking going to prison for it, whether it's taking drugs or, worse, eating nothing but Long John Silvers. And I know people say, what about the children? But prohibition is also having deadly consequences for minors, too. Joe Friedman, who's a UCLA researcher, notes that while the number of fatal overdoses among adolescents doubled from 2019 to 2020, quote, it appears that the rise in deaths was fueled not by greater numbers of teens using drugs. Substance abuse in this age group actually went down during the pandemic, but by use of dangerous and highly potent forms of fentanyl. And as National Institute of Drug Abuse Director Dr. Nora Volkow points out, teens are not trying to do fentanyl on purpose. It's just that now it's so common for any drug to be poisoned with it. Plus, it's not like drugs being illegal is the only reason most people decide to stay away from them. I don't do heroin or crack, regardless of what you may have heard from Greg.
Gun store shelves are now as empty as Cat's medicine cabinet after a long weekend. Or if you're in between puffs on your crack pipe, Cat. Kat does drugs, and she still has a job.
Oh, miss that guy. I don't do drugs, and the reason I don't isn't because it's illegal or because it's hard to get. Finding crack in New York City is easier than finding Shaq in a crowd of kindergartners. It's because I know I would probably love drugs. I would get addicted to drugs, and I haven't really seen it work out too well for anyone when that happens. The best case scenario probably is Hunter Biden, and my dad is slightly less influential than his dad is. You also don't have to agree with me on complete legalization to realize why the plan to designate cartels or drug dealers as terrorists is a really bad idea. Designating a new terrorist group would just give the government more expanded surveillance powers, more excuses to violate civil liberties. And anyone who's been paying attention knows that will definitely be abused. Just like how the Patriot Act was put in place with the promise of protecting us against another 9/11, but wound up violating the rights of everyone from Muslim Americans to parents who criticize their school boards. Plus, the more the government tries to crack down on smuggling, the more you actually push the black market towards fentanyl. Because its potency makes it easier to smuggle because you need smaller amounts, and it's cheaper to produce than heroin is. The black market is gonna look out for itself. It's gonna do the things that make the most sense for its business model. And its business model has been really successful, far more so than Mary Kay. The makeup company, not my friend Mary Kay, who does sell heroin. And who's actually far less annoying than anyone who does sell Mary Kay. Look, I know I might sound crazy to some of you, but honestly, nothing can be as crazy as continuing to do the same thing and to respond to a failed war on drugs by intensifying it. Let's welcome tonight's guest. She talks so fast, I think she's reading the side effects to Adderall. Outnumbered co-host Emily Campagno. He knows so much about the economy, I think he might be in the Illuminati. Host of Kudlow on Fox Business, Larry Kudlow. He looks like a comedian, which is not really a compliment. Fox News contributor Tom Shalhoub. Nobody could ever be in the same boat as him. He's a guy. The NWA's World Television Champion Tyrant. Yay! I don't know. Everything's fine. So Emily, I bet that you came prepared with like no statistics that
None at all.
Been working to memorize and want to rattle off at me right now.
I will say this. That I loved all the points you made in your monologue, but I think, Governor Abbott trying to designate, or actually designating the terrorist groups or the cartels as terrorist groups, I think speaks to the desperation. To me, it speaks to a governor that feels that his president has abdicated his entire duty to safeguard the citizens of the U.S. And all of your stats that you said, it's absolutely right, and it's horrifying. So the fact that teenagers right now are encountering one of every 3 counterfeit pill being laced with fentanyl means that if they just are dabbling at a party,
right.
if they want to take recreational use of opioids, I'm not condoning that, but I'm saying that the risks of death are multiplied by literally millions.
Yeah.
Governor Abbott pointed out that in his executive order, more Americans have died of fentanyl poisoning this past year alone than every global terrorist attack in the last 100 years. We are crying out for help, and our government at the federal level is doing nothing. So him trying to designate them as terrorist organizations, to me, just screams that, man, I need help because my president and this administration is doing nothing to stymie the cartels and stymie China from poisoning Americans, especially our youth.
And look, of course that is, that's a well-intentioned thing, right? And a lot of these are well-intentioned. And I'm just the person who's like, I see how this can be abused. And then I have to wait between 8 to 13 years and then people tell me I was right. A lot of it's well-intentioned, Tom. Wanting to, for example, put the death penalty for drug dealers until you realize that, anyone connected to maybe an overdose, they may be less likely to go get help because they're worried about going to jail themselves. So good intentions doesn't always make a good law.
I think that's true, Kat. Way to do a very nuanced and complex story in the A block.
Yeah. Greg doesn't take that many days off.
I know. Greg usually throws a soft one over the plate in the A block, like, you know, inflation, good or bad?
No, I talked about drugs and kids.
Well, I'll simplify it. Fentanyl is bad.
Yes.
No good, right?
Yes.
It's not good. But I agree that this gesture from Governor Greg Abbott, for instance, I mean, it's not going to do anything. If you read the stories about it, they say he has declared drug cartels to be terrorists. And you read the story and you say, well, what does that do? Really, practically, what happens when that happens? Nothing happens.
Do you want me to answer that? I mean, well, it enables them to criminally prosecute under certain federal laws. It enables them to use, but also state, but under a larger rubric, greater resources. It puts more tools in his tool belt.
And more potential for surveillance from the feds.
Yeah, but I think to him, he's saying, surveillance versus death, you know, in that
That's the same thing they said.
measure.
Again, that's the same thing they said before 9/11.
Think of it this way. Look,
After 9/11.
appreciate your libertarian point of view on this. Okay, I get that. On the other hand, I think you have to distinguish between suppliers and users. I think that the biggest problem here is our border has become wide open. We have no borders. We have no national sovereignty. Joe Biden hadn't done a thing about it except make it worse. Joe Biden never even mentions the word fentanyl, much less do anything about it. And I think there should be strict penalties for suppliers and drug dealers in general, but specifically with fentanyl. The other point to consider is we're letting China get away with murder, like we always do, okay? This stuff, the raw materials, come from China, pass through Mexico, and then come across the border, the open border. So I don't see why we can't do something. I don't want necessarily more government laws insofar as people who are using it, okay? That's a death warrant, and they can figure that out for themselves. I'm very glad that you don't use it. I'm very glad.
Not to brag.
I've been, I've been down that road myself and been sober a long time, thankfully, gracefully, with God's help. But I do think those who sell it should be in deep trouble, whether it's capital punishment or something very difficult. And I do think this president should wake up and see what this open border and unlimited illegal immigration is doing to this country insofar as drugs and crime and sex and all the rest of it. It is an absolute nightmare. And he just stands there or sits there or does something there, nothing to solve the problem.
I do wonder about the sex part of that.
Ew.
But, Tyrus, would you like to?
I did not wonder about the sex part of that. Everyone has strong points, but I'm just going to break it down to how I look at it. If we change the name to fentanyl to anthrax, everyone would be having a heart attack right now. And what does fentanyl do that anthrax doesn't do? It's the same thing. You get it on your fingers, it can poison you. It gets in your food, it can poison you. You breathe it in, it can poison you. So is it a drug or is it a poisoning? And we know where it's coming from, and we know how it's getting in here. So I don't care what you call them, but they're poisoning Americans. And the reason why I don't look at it the same way as a drug, because, and as you pointed out in your monologue, no one is going out on a fentanyl run. So it is being used as a poison, disguised to attack the weakest part of our society. So it is a poisoning. And again, just call it anthrax. And imagine we had one envelope of anthrax sent to the White House, and the entire world stopped. We literally have tons of anthrax being pushed through our border. So to me, I look at it like an act of war. But the problem is it's affecting the lowest point of our society. And until, unfortunately, someone in the White House goes through a fentanyl poisoning or losing a loved one, then maybe they'll look at it as for what it is. So I look at it as a terrorist attack. I don't want people watching my house, but if that means that we're going to do something about this poisoning of America, then I'm all for it. But again, just change the word for 1 second and think how you look at it.
And I think when you talk about, just quickly, of course, fentanyl, when it does have legitimate medical uses in a medical setting, but when you're expecting your drug to be one thing and your fentanyls and your cocaine, then that absolutely is not an overdose. It is a poisoning.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.